Okay, let's get started on the Chapter 12 notes. Chapter 12 focuses on forests and forest management. So, going along with the theme from the rest of this unit, we've talked about soil, we've talked about agriculture, we've talked about biodiversity, we've talked about farming. So now we're going to focus on forestry and how the trees on the planet are harvested. The example from the textbook for this unit is sustainable paper. So make yourself a note on this introduction slide about sustainable paper. And obviously, we hear the terms, going paperless, and in our class, we've obviously taken a big step towards taking a lot of the paper out of the classroom using our iPads, but there is still paper in our everyday lives. And so this is one of the areas that we need to focus on the most, of using the paper that we have wisely, recycling the paper that we've used, growing the trees in a sustainable way. Before we get into the details of how we can do that, we need to just review some basics about forests and forest structures. A forest, let's write down a definition for forest. It's a very simple definition. It's just any ecosystem with a high density of trees. Any ecosystem with a high density of trees. And the two most common ecosystems with a high density of trees are the boreal forests and the tropical forests. So in our tropical zone towards the equator, we have those tropical rainforests. And then the boreal forests mostly stretch over Russia, Canada, up toward between the temperate and the polar regions. Forests are very, very complex. They have multiple layers, they have multiple niches going on, and it makes for a very rich ecosystem. If we look at this picture, we go through the different layers that we would see in a forest. Typically, the upper layer of a forest is called the canopy. And the canopy is just simply where the tops of the trees are. There's two layers below the canopy before we actually get to the smaller plants growing. And one of those isn't actually marked on this picture, so we'll put it in. The subcanopy, just below the canopy, and then the under canopy, sometimes called the understory. Your book calls it the understory. So these are just all these upper layers of the trees. We're still within the upper tree layers. As we go towards the forest floor, we'll have a shrub layer, small bushes and shrubs, and then at the very bottom, we have the floor. So nothing too complex here, no words that are too confusing. We have the canopy, the subcanopy, the understory, the shrub layer, and the floor. In rainforests, we have one extra layer called the emergence. So this layer is only really seen in rainforests. Because rainforests are so dense and this canopy becomes so thick, some trees that can grow very tall actually peek out over the canopy and try to look for resources above that canopy layer. Rainforests are almost, I don't want to call them an exception to the rule, but they are a little different because in most forests, there's a lot of diversity down at the forest floor. Rainforests, though, this canopy layer becomes so thick that there's very little light that makes it down to the floor. The sunshine just cannot get through to the floor, and there's actually not a lot of diversity down at the bottom layer. That's only in a rainforest. So write down that little exception. In the rainforest, the canopy is so thick that the light just can't get down to that forest floor. So you end up with this emergent layer peeking out of the top. Now, we said that rainforests are very complex and they have multiple niches. Let's write down some things that are going on in here that we should know about. There's many forms of shelter that can be found in forests. So they're very complex ecosystems, lots of places for organisms to live. Trees can be a form of shelter. Shrubs can be a form of shelter. Any plant in the forest can be a form of shelter. There's also many sources of food in a forest. Fruits, seeds, leaves, many, many sources of food in the forest. And there's also just many different habitats that can be found. Some organisms specialize to only live in the canopy. Some organisms specialize to only live on the floor. So these ecosystems become very, very complex. One final vocab term that I'd like you to know when you're talking about a forest is the term snag. Snag refers to, S-N-A-G, the snag refers to any fallen or broken trees that are found in the forest. And snags will be important. We'll talk about them again later, so the term's going to come up. But snags are, can be shelter, and snags can be food if they're decaying wood for, bacteria. And snags can be a habitat, a place for an organism to live. It's just a dead or a tree that's fallen over in the woods. Okay, so you have a basic idea of the structure of the forest. If you want to review this, your textbook has a really great diagram, better than even this one here, and it's figure 12.3 in your book. Maybe write that in your notes so when you're studying you can go through and look at it. It has a great caption underneath that picture that kind of reviews all the structures. So we know that forest is very structurally complex and has multiple niches. It has a lot of value. Forests provide ecosystem services. This is like a broken record. Every single chapter, whatever we're talking about, whatever system or area we're talking about, will always come back to the ecosystem services. Here's a couple ecosystem services you can easily remember and associate with forests. The roots of the plants and trees stabilize the soil. Leaf litter at the forest floor slows runoff. And the plants in the ecosystem filter out pollutants and purify the water. Another reason why forests are valuable is carbon storage. Now, plants take in carbon. We should remember this from our studying of photosynthesis in biology class. Plants take in water and carbon dioxide, and they release sugar and oxygen. So forests are valuable because they're taking up that carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. Right now, it's estimated that about 280 billion metric tons of carbon are in the tissues of plants and forests. Cutting down the plants can pose a change or a risk in worsening climate change because CO2 is the primary greenhouse gas. CO2 is the gas that we track the most when we're talking about global warming. Okay. And then other things that the forest provides, plants that can be used for medicines, dyes, and fibers, animals, plants, and fungi that we use for food, and what we talk about mostly in this chapter is the commercial use of the trees for wood. About 30% of the global forests are being used for getting wood from the trees. So 30% of the forests on the planet right now are being commercially logged. Most of the logging in the world occurs in Canada and in Russia because of those boreal forests. And then in the next, if you go from the boreal forests, there is still some logging in the rainforests. That's mostly done in Brazil and Indonesia. So obviously we have some loss of forest on the planet. Deforestation, I'm sure we all know what that means, loss of forest, is the clearing or the loss of any forest. So write down the definition if you want it. You probably know it already, but the clearing or the loss of any forest. And most of our forest loss, most of the reason we cut plants and cut trees down is to make room for agriculture so we can farm more, or because we need wood. Whatever the reason for the deforestation, it causes a big loss in biodiversity and promotes desertification. So these are things we've already talked about in this chapter. The ideas are still the same, but this is just, we're talking more specifically about the cause. So we talked about a lot of reasons, a lot of things that cause a loss of biodiversity. We talked about things that promote desertification, and remember that desertification is going to happen in drier climates. So if we're taking down the forest in drier climates, it's going to be more prone to become a desert. We already talked about the fact that taking down trees adds more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But the good news is the rates of deforestation have actually been declining since 1990. Now, how do we know this? Let's talk about how we know this. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization actually uses satellites to track this. So let's write down the name of that organization. You can abbreviate it really simply as FAO. But what that stands for, FAO, is the UN, United Nations, Food and Agriculture Association. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Association. They actually use satellite data to track the amount of forests on the planet. And the latest data that's been published is from 2010. We can compare that data to the data from the 1990s. What this research has found, what the satellite data has found, is that in 2010, we lost about 5.2 million hectares of forest. 5.2 million hectares of forest. Now, more than 5.2 million hectares were cut down, but a lot of that was replaced or allowed to regrow. So the net loss was 5.2 million acres on the planet. I'm sorry, 5.2 million hectares on the planet. In 1990, when the same research was done, it was estimated that we were losing about 8.3 million hectares every year. So that number is dropping. So that's good news, but we are still losing forest every year. Deforestation is driven by industrialization, right? We're either trying to make more food, more cropland, more rangeland to feed people, because when industrialization occurs, population increases. We know that from our population chapter. Or we just need wood to drive industrialization, to build factories, to burn for fuel. In the United States, if you look over this history, this should be something that's, somewhat familiar to us from our history classes. Deforestation really began in full swing in the mid-1800s. Of course, before then, people were cutting down trees, but they were more cutting down just the trees that they needed. As an industry, the trees really were starting to be taken down in the mid-1800s to make room for farms. And by the late 1800s, not only were we making room for farms, because that didn't stop, but we needed fuel to run our furnaces, to run our factories. And at that point, we really weren't using coal as much as we were just using wood. Now, there's a typo in the third bullet here. We want to just cross off the word not. By the 1900s, very little of the primary or natural forest was left in the United States. By the 1900s, we had cut down almost all of the natural untouched forests. Those primary forests were, of course, the trees would regrow if they weren't being used for farming. If we let the land, if we clear cut the land, take out all the trees, but we let it regrow, you will get a secondary forest. But secondary forests tend to have smaller trees, less complexity, and just different species of trees than primary forests. You should have picked up from that activity we did with the trees last week on biodiversity that having a forest of only one species of tree is just not as healthy, it's not as biodiverse as having a forest with many different types of trees. A lot of times, secondary forests are replanted with only one species. So we know our history in the United States, but you basically see this same pattern over and over again in developing nations. Some nations are going through this right now. It's the same historical patterns. First, we cut down the trees to make room for increased farming. Then we cut down the trees to drive our industry until very little of the primary forests are left. Right now, in developing nations, there's a little bit of a back and forth battle to conserve or to use the trees that are there. In some cases,